The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large hen-pecking wife.
There are moments in television history that don't just live on in memory. They lodge themselves so deep into the cultural consciousness that decades pass, empires of entertainment rise and fall, and still, those moments refuse to leave. Most of the time, the scenes people remember are the ones that made them laugh the hardest, cry the most, or gasp at a twist they never saw coming. But occasionally, just occasionally, the scene that endures the longest is the one that made people deeply, genuinely uncomfortable. That is the story of Fawlty Towers. More specifically, it's a story of one episode, one performance, one sequence of events inside a fictional hotel lobby that would ignite a firestorm so fierce it nearly erased one of British television's greatest achievements from existence. The show itself was already extraordinary before controversy ever entered the picture. 12 episodes. Just 12. And yet, Fawlty Towers accomplished what most sitcoms with 100 episodes never come close to achieving. It became part of the language, the culture, the shared shorthand of an entire nation. It was bold, it was unapologetic, and it was side-splittingly funny in a way that felt almost dangerous, like the writers knew exactly where the line was and chose to march straight past it with a grin. But somewhere in that small catalog of chaos, one particular scene pushed past a line that no amount of cleverness, no layers of satire, no insistence on artistic intent could fully uncross. And when that moment arrived, broadcast live into the living rooms of a nation still carrying the weight of living memory, the consequences were real. So what exactly happened? What was in that scene that made BBC executives sweat, that filled the network's mailrooms with angry letters, that sparked debates which are still raging today? And more critically, was it comedy genius taken too far, or was it always destined to cause damage? Stick around, because the full story is far more complicated and far more interesting than you might think. To understand why Fawlty Towers existed at all, you have to go back to 1970, back to a sleepy seaside town in Devon called Torquay, back to a hotel that should have been utterly forgettable, but ended up being one of the most consequential pieces of real estate in British comedy history. The Monty Python team had descended on Torquay to film Flying Circus. They were looking for somewhere to stay, nothing glamorous, just functional accommodation in a place that didn't require too much thought. What they found instead was the Gleneagles Hotel, managed by a man named Donald Sinclair. And managed is perhaps the most generous possible word for what he was doing. Sinclair wasn't just difficult. He was theatrical in his dysfunction. He didn't merely fail at hospitality. He performed failure with a kind of demented confidence that most people reserve for their greatest professional accomplishments. He regarded guests not as customers to be served, but as intruders to be managed, suspects to be watched, and problems to be solved before they caused too much inconvenience. Eric Idle once left his briefcase briefly in the lobby. A normal hotel manager would have called out to ask whose bag it was. Sinclair didn't do that. Without hesitation, without inquiry, without the slightest pause for rational thought, he picked up the briefcase and threw it over a garden wall. His reasoning? He decided it was a bomb. The briefcase, belonging to a member of one of Britain's most celebrated comedy groups, went sailing over a wall and into a garden because its owner had made the mistake of briefly setting it down. Terry Gilliam made the error of using his knife and fork in a way Sinclair considered incorrect. The manager marched over and corrected his table manners as though improper utensil etiquette were a prosecutable offense. Complaints from other guests were met not with apologies or solutions, but with open, barely veiled contempt. Sinclair didn't just fail to improve situations, he made them measurably worse. And he did it with the absolute conviction of a man who believed himself to be entirely in the right. John Cleese was baffled, but he was also fascinated. Here, walking among them, was something genuinely rare. A man so completely and catastrophically wrong for his chosen profession that he had somehow transcended ordinary failure and entered the realm of the absurd. Cleese watched. Cleese took notes, literal notes, the kind a scientist might take observing a strange new specimen. And years later, Sitting across from his then-wife and creative partner Connie Booth, he would pour everything he had observed into a character who would become one of the most recognizable figures in television history. Basil Fawlty was born from reality. That's what makes him so devastatingly funny. And that's what makes the darkness that would eventually surround the show feel so loaded. Because something built on truth carries weight that pure fiction never quite can. Before Basil Fawlty, before Monty Python, before any of it, there was a gangly boy from Weston-super-Mare who was already over 6 feet tall at 13 and hadn't quite figured out what to do with himself. John Cleese grew up the only child of Reginald Cleese, an insurance salesman who had, in 1923, done something deeply telling about the family's relationship with absurdity. He legally changed the family surname. The original name was Cheese. Reginald, believing this too ridiculous for a respectable man, officially became Cleese. Whether or not he appreciated the irony of a man named Cheese finding his own name too silly is a question history has not answered. Young John excelled at school, cricket, boxing, academic performance. But beneath the conventional achievements, something else was quietly forming. At Clifton College, he once painted footprints leading away from a statue of Field Marshal Haig, as though the long-dead military commander had wandered off to use the facilities. It was an odd joke. It was also a perfect joke. Dry, visual, absurdist committed. It was the kind of humor that doesn't just want to laugh, but wants you to think about why you're laughing. At 17, he was passed over for a house prefect position despite his academic record. He said later that it shifted something in his view of authority, that fairness wasn't guaranteed, that institutions often rewarded the wrong things for the wrong reasons. That particular wound would echo through his entire creative life. Basil Fawlty is, among other things, a man who believes he deserves more than the world has given him, and that belief is the engine of almost every disaster he creates. Cleese eventually made it to Downing College, Cambridge, where he studied law. But law was never really the destination. It was the waiting room. At a student fair, the Footlights Theater Club asked if he could sing or dance. He told them flatly that no, he couldn't, and that if there was anything worse than his dancing, it was his singing. When they asked what he could do, his answer was simple: I make people laugh. That was the door, and once through it, everything accelerated. At Footlights, he met Graham Chapman, Tim Brook-Taylor, Bill Oddie. He began building a strange, cerebral, and narcic comedic sensibility that would eventually find its purest expression not in the collective madness of Monty Python, but in the controlled, pressurized chaos of 12 episodes set inside a crumbling hotel. His father, practical to the end, kept sending him newspaper advertisements for retail management jobs even after he graduated with his law degree in 1963, just in case the comedy thing didn't work out. Whether or not the elder Cleese ever fully grasped what his son had built is unclear. What is clear is that the retail management career never materialized, and the comedy thing worked out rather extraordinarily well. Fawlty Towers didn't begin as a sure thing. It began as an idea between two people who had shared something bizarre in Torquay and couldn't stop thinking about it. John Cleese and Connie Booth, comedian and actress, husband and wife, creative partners, sat down together and asked themselves a question. What if you took the most inappropriate possible person for a job, put him in that job permanently, and watched the consequences unfold in real time every single week? The answer was Basil Fawlty, proprietor of Fawlty Towers Hotel in Torquay, permanently on the edge of a complete breakdown, constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone, driven by a desperate, tragic desire to impress the kind of upper-class guests who would never, under any circumstances, be impressed by him. A man whose snobbery was matched only by his incompetence, and whose greatest enemy was himself, though he would spend every waking moment convinced the problem was everyone else. When the show premiered on the BBC in 1975, the critical reception was, to put it generously, uncertain. One review called it a disaster. The critics were confused by the pace, by the relentlessness of it, by the way the humor never quite let you off the hook. But the audience understood immediately. There was something about Basil, his towering frame, his manic eyes, his absolute inability to accept defeat, even as defeat crushed him from every direction, that felt immediately, painfully recognizable. He was everyone who had ever been convinced they were right when they were catastrophically wrong. He was everyone who had ever let pride do the thinking. Prunella Scales as Sybil was the immovable object to Basil's unstoppable force, sharp-tongued, ruthlessly perceptive, with a single syllable of Basil, capable of communicating everything from contempt to exasperation to a very particular kind of exhausted love. Connie Boots Polly was the only genuinely sane person in the building, doing her best to prevent each episode from becoming a full disaster while knowing, somewhere deep down, that prevention was never really possible. And then there was Manuel. Andrew Sachs gave Manuel, the earnest, hapless Spanish waiter from Barcelona, though he understood very little, a quality that should have been impossible to achieve in a character whose primary function was confusion. He made him genuinely lovable. Manuel wasn't the butt of the joke in the way the scripts might have suggested on paper. He was, in many ways, the most human person in the hotel. He wanted to do well. He tried. He just never quite managed, and the world punished him relentlessly for it. The BBC nearly canceled the show after the first 6 episodes. It was reruns that saved it, audiences discovering it on second and third viewing, and spreading the word with an intensity that network executives eventually couldn't ignore. A second series was commissioned, and then, after that, nothing. 12 episodes. Done. Cleese and Booth had divorced by the time they filmed the second series. They worked together anyway, professionally, without apparent bitterness, and produced what many consider the show's finest episodes. Their artistic chemistry survived what their marriage couldn't. Now we arrive at the episode at the center of everything. The one that became, in the years and decades that followed, the most discussed, most debated, most controversial piece of television the show ever produced. The episode was called The Germans. On the surface, the premise was pure Fawlty Towers. A group of German tourists checks into the hotel, and Basil, already suffering from a concussion following an injury earlier in the episode, becomes fixated on the idea of not mentioning the Second World War. He issues the instruction explicitly to his staff. He knows he mustn't. He is aware, in the particular way Basil is sometimes aware of his own worst impulses, that this is exactly where things could go terribly wrong. And then, because he is Basil Fawlty, and the universe has a contract with chaos where he is concerned, it goes terribly wrong. Within moments of meeting his German guests, Basil begins dropping references to the war. One becomes several. Several become a torrent. What starts as nervous overcorrection accelerates into a full spiral. References to Nazi Germany, Hitler comparisons, and then, in the sequence that would cement the episode's place in television history, a full goose-step march through the hotel lobby accompanied by an over-the-top impression of Adolf Hitler. It was outrageous. It was completely committed. It was, from a purely technical standpoint of comedic performance, extraordinary. Cleese throwing himself into the absurdity with a kind of physical abandon that requires either great courage or absolutely no self-preservation instinct whatsoever. And it caused an uproar. Letters flooded into the BBC. Critics called it tasteless. Some demanded the episode be pulled permanently. There were voices, serious and sincere voices, arguing that no amount of comedic framing made it acceptable to goose-step through a hotel lobby doing Hitler impressions on primetime British television, and that doing so made light of a history that was, for many people watching, not distant history at all, but living memory. The BBC debated it seriously. Executives were uncomfortable. The episode was nearly shelved. In the end it stayed, but only after significant internal pressure. And the debate didn't end there. The response in Germany itself was more nuanced. Some German viewers understood the satire perfectly. They saw the episode for what it was, a savage mockery not of Germany or Germans, but of a particular strain of British nostalgia, the peculiar national obsession with the war that led people like Basil to be unable to encounter a German without mentally re-fighting the entire conflict. They laughed, because the joke was clearly on Basil. But others, those whose families had lived through the war, who had lost people, who carried that history in their bodies rather than as an abstract cultural reference, found it deeply painful. There's a difference between satire that punches up and satire that, regardless of intent, reopens wounds that haven't fully closed. Cleese himself has never backed down from defending the episode. His argument has always been consistent. The joke was never about the Germans. It was about Basil. It was about English insularity and arrogance, and the particular cultural disease of a nation that can't stop refighting a war it won 70 years ago. The Germans in the episode aren't the punchline. They're remarkably patient and reasonable, watching with increasingly bewildered expressions as the Englishman in front of them self-destructs in slow motion. The target of the comedy is always Basil's ignorance. That was always the point. He isn't wrong. And yet, the episode didn't disappear overnight. It aired, it was watched, it was debated, and then it settled into the uncomfortable corner of the national memory reserved for things we love but aren't entirely sure we should. For decades, the Germans existed in a kind of cultural limbo, part of the show's legacy, clearly one of its most memorable episodes, but never quite comfortable. People quoted it. "Don't mention the war" became one of the most recognized phrases in British pop culture, a shorthand for a very specific kind of English awkwardness about European relations that turned out to be remarkably durable well into the 21st century. But then the streaming era arrived, and with it, a new kind of reckoning. When old television begins circulating on global platforms, it gets watched by audiences who didn't grow up with it, don't have the cultural context for it, and evaluate it by the standards of the present rather than the past. The Germans, which had always been a complicated episode even for audiences who understood it, became a flashpoint. Several streaming platforms removed it entirely. Others edited it, cutting specific scenes or lines. The goose-step was gone from some versions. The Hitler impression disappeared from others. Fans were furious. To those who loved the show, the edits weren't protection. They were a fundamental misreading. Fawlty Towers had never been a show that punched down. It had always been a show about exposing the absurdity of people like Basil, petty, snobbish, self-important, constitutionally unable to recognize their own worst qualities. Removing the most extreme expression of those qualities didn't make the show safer. It made it dishonest. John Cleese put it with characteristic directness. The war jokes weren't aimed at Germans. They were aimed at the British obsession with the war and at Basil's stupidity. To edit the episode was to misunderstand every single thing the show had ever been trying to do. Here is what is true. Fawlty Towers was never a safe show. It wasn't designed to be. It was designed to be uncomfortable in the precise, controlled, purposeful way that great satire is always uncomfortable. Because satire that never makes anyone squirm isn't satire. It's just praise with jokes attached. Basil Fawlty was a vehicle for exposing something real about a certain kind of English character. His snobbery, his self-delusion, his inability to see himself clearly, his talent for turning every situation into a catastrophe while remaining convinced the problem was everyone else. These weren't lovable quirks. They were indictments. The show was laughing at Basil, and through him, at a whole set of attitudes it found deserving of mockery. The Germans was that project taken to its furthest extreme. The result was an episode so perfectly engineered in its comic catastrophe that it became instantly iconic, and so loaded with historical weight that it never stopped being controversial. Andrew Sachs, who bore the physical consequences of the show's commitment to its comedy more than anyone, bruised by real frying pans, burned in fire scenes, returning to set with a smile each time, passed away in 2016. Prunella Scales has battled vascular dementia in recent years. Her husband, Timothy West, speaking with quiet tenderness about her enduring warmth even as memory fades. Connie Booth walked away from entertainment entirely, building a career in psychotherapy, leaving the chaos she helped create on screen behind her without apparent regret. And John Cleese, now in his 80s, announced plans for a Fawlty Towers reboot, co-written with his daughter Camilla, promising to bring Basil into the modern world. Whether that project will ever equal what came before is a question nobody can answer. Lightning, as the saying goes, doesn't strike twice. But the original 12 episodes remain, undiminished, a little complicated, exactly as they were always meant to be. Don't mention the war, Basil says, and promptly mentions nothing else. The Germans look on with patient bewilderment. The audience laughs or winces, or does both at once. And the hotel, somehow keeps running.